We ended the scientific revolution by discussing the achievements of Newton. These achievements would lead directly into the movement known as the Enlightenment. While in a general sense, the term Enlightenment refers to an intellectual movement that sought to make the general public more aware of the world around them, Immanuel Kant provided a pithy definition of the era with his Latin phrase sapere aude. This means dare to know, and nicely summarizes the Enlightenment period. Enlightenment thinkers wanted intellectuals, indeed everyone, to take the risk inherent in investigating the world. Rather than going into things with preconceived notions, Enlightenment thinkers wanted to reassess the world around them afresh. We will see how they did this, and how successful they were as we discuss the period. It is oftentimes stated that we live in a modern, or even a postmodern world. What does that mean? Shortly, the modern world is a world created by the Enlightenment. First of all, the Enlightenment is the period when progress began to be anticipated, and the achievements of the scientific revolution applauded for what they were. No longer would tradition, authority, and the ancients reign supreme. Instead, moderns, or contemporary thinkers, could provide perfectly good answers to life's problems. In fact, Enlightenment thinkers were the ones who maintained that newer ideas were better than older ones. This is a logical outcome of the scientific revolution, but, as we shall see, it applied to much more than science. It applied to society as a whole. You will recall that John Locke developed what he called natural rights. These were taken to be the laws of politics. They described how politics ought to be undertaken. Galileo simply uncovered the laws of physics, and Newton discovered the law of gravity. One of the key ideas, for good or ill, of the Enlightenment was to search for natural laws for other aspects of life. The influential Scotsman Adam Smith sought the laws of economics and supply and demand. Others sought laws to govern familial relations, religion, even happiness. One wonders what the law of happiness would have looked like. I highly doubt that the conclusions of the French scholar Condorcet, who said that happiness could be solved through a mathematical equation, would be particularly appealing to most people today. Over the course of the Enlightenment project, several ideas appeared with such regularity that they could be considered the core intellectual theories of the Enlightenment. These are individualism, relativism, and rationalism. Individualism simply means that the individual is paramount. While you might be a member of a group, your happiness and satisfaction are ultimately a solitary enterprise. It's up to the individual to develop a satisfying lifestyle. Relativism can be understood as the undermining of absolute truths. What is right for one person in a situation may not be right for all people, or for that one person in other situations. In other words, morality is relative. According to this theory, it is impossible to declare that some things are absolutely right and others are absolutely wrong. These are situational. It does bear noting that this is contradictory to normative Christianity. Christians believe that some actions are right and others are wrong. When the Enlightenment thinkers advocated relativism, they were trying to undermine Christianity. Relativism also had a cultural component that is more acceptable to Christians. Cultural relativism maintains that no one culture can be considered the correct or normal culture, and all others are wrong. In other words, you cannot judge another culture by the standards of your culture. A Frenchman couldn't say that the English were wrong because they didn't do something the French way, just as a German couldn't say the Japanese way of life was inferior to the German. Rationalism simply means that the best way to approach a problem is to seek a reasonable way of explaining and answering it. Rationalists generally believe that all problems have solutions if we can just be reasonable about the way we approach things. This optimistic concept may be largely discredited now, but it was an important idea that propelled the Enlightenment forward. Another core element of the Enlightenment period was the growth of religious skepticism. By this, I mean an increasingly questioning attitude towards Christianity rather than tacit acceptance. One of the reasons for this growth was the Protestant Reformation. An advantage of having a universal Catholic Church to which everyone belonged is that the Church was largely believed to have the answers to life's problems. Once there were multiple churches, questions arose as to which of these churches had the right answer, and how could one choose between them. Increasingly, people began to challenge or abandon the Church entirely when they were unable to reconcile these challenges. I introduced René Descartes in the Scientific Revolution. There, I discussed his Discourse on Method, where he questioned anything that could be doubted. Descartes himself publicly stated his belief and faith in God, but others would use his methods to question God's role in the world, or even his very existence. This growing religious skepticism led to the growth of two related movements. The first is deism. This philosophy believed that God existed and created the world, but since then he has not intervened in how the universe works. After all, deists believed, if the world was created according to natural laws, then these laws, and not divine action, explained why things happened. Necessarily, deists didn't believe in miracles, since miracles imply God's intervention in the world. Many leading Enlightenment thinkers all over the world, from Voltaire to Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, were deists. Atheism also began to grow during the Enlightenment. Atheism is the belief that God does not exist. Atheism differs, therefore, from both Christianity and deism, which believe in God. Atheists argued that everything in the world could be explained in material, not spiritual terms, and refused to believe in supernatural beings or events. Rather than trying to tackle the entire Enlightenment movement, which spanned countries, continents, and hemispheres, I will concentrate on the Enlightenment movement within France. These French Enlightenment thinkers became known as the philosophes. The philosophes centered their activities on the city of Paris. Remember that in the mid-1600s, Louis XIV had moved the capital of France from Paris to Versailles, so the government presence in Paris had greatly declined. Culturally and socially, though, Paris was still an important place, and the philosophes made it more so. One of the ways that the philosophes differed from earlier philosophers was their emphasis on practical philosophy. The philosophes didn't just want to work on abstract themes, but wanted to come up with workable solutions to real problems. One of the ways that they hoped to see their vision come true was to encourage wider education. Only if more of the population became basically educated could the Enlightenment program spread to the numbers of people they hoped to help. One of the ways in which the philosophes went about educating the populace was by writing books about important science topics and popularizing them. What I mean by this is that the Enlightenment authors would write relatively easy-to-read books about the complicated, but interesting and important topics covered by the scientific revolution. In this way, many scientific concepts became more commonly known than in the past. As an example, the theory of gravity is clearly one of the most important scientific theories in Western civilization, but Newton described it in a difficult-to-read, dense Latin that was full of calculus word problems. You can imagine that not many people, certainly none who weren't already interested in the subject, were able to get much out of the Principia. It was actually Voltaire, who we'll discuss shortly, who popularized Newton's theory. Another great popularizer was Bernard de Fontenelle. On the right here is an image taken from his book on the plurality of the worlds. The book aimed to describe the major revolutions then taking place in astronomy, pardon the pun. As you might be able to tell from the picture, Fontenelle's book is a conversation between a scientist and a woman. The scientist is trying to dumb down the science enough for her to understand it. The implication is that if he can get her to grasp the ideas, then anyone who can read this book will be able to as well. Condescending, yes, but also effective and important for the spread of science. A few moments ago, I mentioned that the philosophes lived in Paris. I want to get a bit more specific about where the philosophes' ideas came from. Prior to the Enlightenment, the two main areas where ideas were generated were universities and royal courts. Universities make sense, since this is where professors wrote and tested their theories. Other thinkers traveled to the court of the king, hoping to get him to support and fund their ventures. The Enlightenment didn't take place in either of these locations. Instead, it developed in the salon. The salon was the entrance room into a wealthy person's house. When you went to visit someone in Paris, you'd be shown into their salon. That would be where you and your host would have your meeting and entertainment. During the Enlightenment, these gatherings could get quite large, as you can see in this image. Usually, these get-togethers were hosted by women, whose job as host was also to make sure the conversations stayed as polite as possible. Therefore, the ideas of the philosophes were generated in the context of polite conversation, not teachings in the classroom or the attempt to weasel money out of the king. This difference would have an impact on what kind of ideas sprung up and how they were expressed. The first philosophe I want to mention was the Baron Montesquieu. In some ways, he was the first philosophe and the father of the French Enlightenment. Although he wrote quite a bit, I want to focus on his two most important works. The first of these was the Persian Letters, a book that in some ways can be considered the founding document of the French Enlightenment. The book claims to be a collection of letters that Montesquieu found that had been accidentally left behind in Paris by a Persian visiting the city. These letters tore apart French society, culture, and politics. This would have been especially demeaning, since the French thought themselves far superior to Persians. How dare they mock the French? course, as you may have guessed, there was no such Persian who wrote these letters. That was a fiction Montesquieu invented. He feared getting in trouble for his ideas, so he pretended to have someone else state them. Amongst other things, the Persian letters mocked the king and the absolutist system. By bringing up these ideas as potential conversations, Montesquieu provided Solons quite a bit to think and talk about. Montesquieu's other major work came over 2 decades later. This book is well known by students of American government for reasons that will soon become obvious. This book, On the Spirit of the Laws, investigates how countries get the governments they currently have. Montesquieu argues that different states have different governments that either do or do not fit that state very well. As such, he took a relativist attitude towards government. As you might have imagined, he did not believe that absolutism fit France properly. He didn't say that absolutism is always bad. In fact, some countries, like Russia or China, could thrive under absolutism. France, though, according to Montesquieu, should have a balanced government. He took this idea from the misunderstanding of the British government, but it would have immense consequences, especially for the future United States. Montesquieu argued that absolutism's problem was that it gave the executive, legislative, and judicial functions all to one man. He argued that France ought to break these powers up amongst different branches and give different people the executive, legislative, and judicial powers. This did not happen in France for a long time, but it would lay the groundwork for the American Constitution, written some 40 years later. Even more famous in his own day than Montesquieu was Voltaire. This was not his real name. He had been baptized François-Marie Arouet. He realized, though, that publishing under his own name led to trouble, so he took up the pen name Voltaire for his later works. Voltaire made his living as a satirist. He made fun of his society in a humorous way. While he aimed at being funny, he also wanted to make a difference. Sometimes he criticized things too harshly, and he suffered for it. France had an official censorship department, and anything legally published in France needed its approval. Sometimes Voltaire got this approval. At other times, he published anyway. Most of the time, he tried to hide what he was saying from the censors and get things published that really did criticize the government. Often, these attacks later became known. Once, he was badly beaten and exiled from the country. Many times, he was thrown into the infamous jail known as the Bastille. None of this kept him quiet for long. In fact, he spent his exile learning about England, writing further satires, and, as already mentioned, mastering Newton's ideas. Voltaire first traveled to Paris to attend law school. His father even regularly sent him money to support his studies. But Voltaire never enrolled and instead used his father's money to live off of. His father didn't know this until Voltaire got into trouble in 1718 for one of the more offensive things he had written. Specifically, in his Enlightenment retelling of the Greek story Oedipus, Voltaire all but accused the Duke of Orleans, a close relative of the king, of impregnating his own daughter. Voltaire was not the only person to think this was true of the Duke, but he turned it into a play for all of Paris to see. You can imagine why the king and the censors had problems with Voltaire. Voltaire didn't let persecution stop him. Over the course of his life, he wrote over 2,000 things, books, pamphlets, and articles. He is certainly one of the most prolific authors ever. In fact, he made so much money from his writing that he is often considered the first professional writer. Prior to the Enlightenment, authors made their money some other way than publishing. They may have been a professional scientist who made their living that way, or they may have been a poet who got his money from dedicating poems to important people. Voltaire, though, made money off his work, and he is significant for this. Of all his works, the 3 most significant are Candide, the Treatise on Toleration, and the Philosophical Dictionary. Candide is a novel that follows Candide on a number of adventures, during which terrible, horrible things happen to Candide and his companions. It is considered a comedy, though, because of Candide's reaction to tragedy. Candide was raised to be an optimist, so no matter what happens, Candide sees the bright side of things. After all, he survived, and things could have been worse. Throughout, Voltaire criticizes this attitude towards life, and also takes aim at the governments and churches that allow such things to happen. The Treatise on Toleration was a significant work because it expressed Voltaire's attitude on religious persecution. He was a deist, but he believed that the government should grant freedom of religion to its peoples. In other words, France should legalize Protestantism, Judaism, and other religions, since it is the oppression of other religions that leads to problems, not the coexistence of multiple faiths. He argues persuasively that religious intolerance leads to greater crimes than religious pluralism. The Philosophical Dictionary is a useful work to gain an understanding of what Voltaire was all about. This is a dictionary of dozens of topics and Voltaire's attitude towards them. In most instances, he took a different position from that of the church or government. When he submitted it to the government censors, they replied that the book was, quote, blasphemous, treasonous, and injurious to scholarship, end quote. In other words, he insulted God, the government, and made people stupider. As you might expect, it flew off of bookshelves when it was eventually printed. Although persecuted in his lifetime, after his death, Voltaire became something of a hero to many French people. In fact, in 1791, after the French Revolution had swept away the Absentist government, the new French government gave Voltaire a state funeral. He was only the second person to be honored in that way. This event shows what an impact he had on many French people, and would have a major influence on many of the people who carried out the French Revolution. Another major philosophe and colleague of Voltaire was Denis Diderot. His major accomplishment was as editor of the Encyclopedia. This collection of books attempted to gather together the official Enlightenment stance on the major issues of the day. The books were certainly biased in an Enlightenment direction, but also reveal much about what educated 18th century people thought about the world around them. All the major philosophers contributed articles to this project. Diderot wrote some, as did Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, and even the economist Adam Smith. It took over 20 years to finish, but Diderot did ultimately release the 35-volume collection. Part of the reason it took so long was political. Diderot had a difficult time with the censors. Part of the reason was financial. This was such a massive, expensive project that it was hard to sell. In the end, many sets were sold on payment plans. The goal was to get the ideas of the Enlightenment out there to be read, and the encyclopedia was a major part of this plan. The final philosophe I will talk about here is also one of the most problematic. Unlike the other men I've talked about, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was not French. He was Swiss. He moved to Paris for work, however, and interacted with the major figures I've already discussed. He never entirely fit in, though, and he developed problems with the others, especially Voltaire. Rousseau felt that you needed to back up your actions with deeds. He never took a job that was connected with the government. He copied handwritten sheets of music repeatedly, a job that photocopiers have made unnecessary. Voltaire and others were willing to accept handouts from powerful rich people when they were offered, and Rousseau felt this could compromise their ideas. He was open in his criticism, and he eventually broke company with the philosophes and returned to Switzerland. Before that, though, he published a number of important works. The most significant was The Social Contract. This book was the first positive assessment of democracy in centuries. Most political scientists thought that people were too ignorant and stupid to make good political decisions and stayed away from democracy. Rousseau, however, felt that groups of people could make good choices. His theory of the general will summed this up. He believed that every person has a desire, called his or her will. He also believed that groups of people had a collective will of the group. The general will was the will of a nation. If this could be discerned, then true democracy was both positive and possible. The problem was in how the general will could be determined, because Rousseau argued that it wasn't so simple as voting. The difficulties of this would have lasting consequences. Rousseau wasn't limited to politics. He also wrote an educational treatise titled Amelie. Just as his Social Contract was the first serious work on democracy, Amelie was the first major treatment of educational philosophy. Rousseau's idea was that society was what ruins children's schooling, and the best way to learn was to allow kids to discover the world on their own. This would never happen, so he encouraged an educational system of tutors leading children through their education outside of schools. In this way, they would learn at their pace and what they wanted and or needed to know. Another of Rousseau's major works was his Confessions. Again, this was an autobiography, and the first serious autobiography in about 1,300 years. He finished it in 1770, but didn't publish it. Instead, it was his family who published it after his death. The Confessions didn't just recount the events of Rousseau's life, but it also included his personal thoughts and recollections. He revealed his attitudes about topics and his true feelings about other people. Perhaps that's why he didn't want it published. Nevertheless, the open discussion of emotions was unique, and Confessions is considered by many to be the first work of what was later named the Romantic movement. With Rousseau, we also move beyond the Enlightenment, opening up ideas about democracy and literature that will be discussed later on in different contexts.